also to Ranji Khanna and the FHI for coordinating this event with us. I did want to note that the Blackburn Festival, this is the Blackburn Fiction Festival, and that gets its name from William Maxwell Blackburn, who joined the English department in 1926 and taught his first creative writing course in 1932. He then continued to teach creative writing courses, but also literary criticism courses into the 1960s, and was an influential teacher who inspired writers who were undergraduates here, such as Reynolds Price and James Applewhite, who themselves ended up teaching creative writing and literary criticism at Duke subsequently. And in 1959, Blackburn initiated a literary festival for the purpose of bringing practicing writers to Duke. And so, though this festival doesn't trace directly back to that, for the last couple of decades we've held creative writing festivals at Duke. We call these Blackburn Festivals in order to acknowledge the importance of William Blackburn for creative writing at Duke. And our event tonight is in a sense a way of trying to bring together in the same space and time two artist residencies that are that are happening at different times, but which both have strong resonance with one another. And so Amit is here this week for a residency that's part of the FHI's World Arts Series. And Caryl Phillips will be conducting a 2-week-long residency here at Duke through the English department in February of the next year, February 2020. And Ranji had noted at one point that it would be fabulous if we could allow these two writers to converse with one another in actual real time, as both write novels, both experiment with form in ways that, in Ranji's words, belie easy characterization of the post-colonial writer. Both have explored the post-colonial city of London extensively in their writing, and both also have experimented with not only novels, but also with other genres and media. And to judge from book blurbs, and also from conversations with each, each respects the work of the other greatly. Luckily for us then, Caryl happens to be in town this week, and that allowed us to bring together these two authors, both through the fiction focus of this year's Blackburn Festival, and then also through the world arts focus of the FHI. And so, a quick note of the format, each author will read for about 25-30 minutes, and then after both readings are completed, we'll have some time for discussion, and there'll be also a book signing by the two authors after that. That's a general introduction to the event tonight, and then my colleague Arthi Vada will introduce Caryl Phillips, and then following Caryl's talk, or reading, my colleague Misha Maran will introduce Amit Chaudhuri. So I'll give the floor to Arthi. I'm not actually sure that's on.
Okay. Hi everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Caryl Phillips this evening. His novels, plays, anthologies, and nonfiction have moved me personally ever since I first encountered The Nature of Blood as a graduate student. And this was the first novel I'd ever read by Caryl, and I did so under the occasion of being asked to write a reference guide for undergraduates. And I remember thinking, a reference guide for a novel? What would that even be? But in fact, it was a really interesting assignment for me, because I saw the way that Caryl's novels were the product of deep historical research, but they read in such a light way that you didn't quite notice the degree of scaffolding that went into them. So writing this guide and following the paths of the characters, the settings, the historical allusions in The Nature of Blood hooked me and made me want to read more. And I've been following his fiction ever since then. And I really do think that Caryl's work has given rise to whole new ways of thinking about collective memory and international belonging, concepts that I see in academia, like multi-directional memory and the anthological novel, things which I'm happy to talk more about later when we do Q&A, but for now, I want to say that I don't think they would have the same force without the inspiration or example of Caryl Phillips' work. And so now I will go into the resume. Caryl Phillips was born in St. Kitts, brought up in Leeds, and now lives in the US. He is the editor of 2 anthologies. He's written for television, radio, film, theater, and is the author of 3 works of nonfiction and 8 novels. Crossing the River was shortlisted for the 1993 Booker Prize. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Oxford University, and among his literary prizes and awards, he has won the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, a Lannan Fellowship, and Britain's oldest literary award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. His novel, A Distant Shore, won the 2004 Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and Dancing in the Dark won the 2006 Pen Beyond the Margins Prize. Very well decorated. He is presently professor of English at Yale, and we are lucky to be having him join us in the spring, as Rob mentioned. And so please join me now in welcoming Caryl Phillips.
Thank you. Full. Yeah, well researched. Thank you. Some of it may even be true. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. What most people probably don't know is that for the past few years, Amit and I have been in kind of quite regular email conversation with each other. We email about this, about that. We've tried to do readings together on a couple of occasions. The times and the dates have not quite worked out. And today's the first time I ever met him. So thank you, Duke, for bringing me together with somebody who I feel I've known, not just professionally, but personally as a friend. But when we had lunch today, it felt like a circle, a nice circle had been closed. So thank you. I'm going to read from a novel that was published last year. I discovered this morning at about 5 o'clock that it was published in paperback earlier this year in this country, and the publisher hadn't sent me any copies because I was scrambling around the house in the dark trying to find the copy that I read from, because you know you have a copy that you marked up, and I couldn't find it. So I found the English paperback, and then I emailed my American agent and said, where are my paperback copies of the novel? And she said, quite rightly, about 10 o'clock this morning, she emailed and said, well, how come you've only just noticed? What have you been doing this year? To which I had no coherent response, because I should have noticed, but at least I have noticed now. So I'm reading from this freshly marked up copy. It's a novel that was really, I guess inspired, this is a rather grandiose word, but there's a British writer, or a British Caribbean writer, who I've always admired, called Jean Rhys. And I've loved her work. And a few years ago, I sort of got it into my head that I wanted to write something about her. So I actually did start to write a film about her. I went to London, I interviewed her editor, who was still alive. She was in her 90s at that stage. I went to her retirement home, and I talked to her for about an hour. She's a very famous editor called Diana Attill, and at the end of the hour or so, hour and a half of talking to her, I realized I didn't want to write a film about her. I wanted to write a novel about her. She was that complicated a character. But my hesitation initially in writing about her was that she's deeply canonical, so there's so much work about her life, and so much is written about her, that I thought, where's the space for a writer to write about a person who is so well entrenched and whose biographical details are so well known? Born in 1890 in Dominica, died in London in 1979, came to England in 1907, and a very tempestuous and turbulent life, but very well documented. So where's the space for a writer to write a piece of fiction about somebody who's so much in the public domain? after talking with Diana Attil, I began to try to find a space that I could occupy and write about that hadn't been filled in. And luckily, there was a 6-week period in her life where nobody really knows what happened. And it took place in 1936, when she and her then second husband went back to Dominica. At that stage, she had left when she was 16. A white West Indian with a very strong West Indian accent. She'd been born and grown up in the Caribbean. She migrated to Edwardian London, where she was regarded as a oddity, because she was kind of blonde and fair. But when she spoke, she sounded more akin to Bob Marley. She had such a strong accent that people just didn't know what she was. So she confused London and Britain on all those basic staffs of identity, such as race, certainly gender, because she was for a period of time a prostitute, she was an alcoholic. She was an uncategorizable migrant, which I think is a deeply respectable thing to be. But it caused her great misery. Her dream had been to go back to Dominica at some point, where she imagined her life would somehow be rescued from the misery of London and Paris. And in 1936, she went back to Dominica for 6 weeks. And not much is known. There's a few photographs, but not much is really known about what happened. But she never went back when she left. And she left deeply unhappy at the end of this 6 weeks, and her life spiraled pretty much out of control after that back in England. So I took this 6-week period and tried to look at that episode in her life, where I could wander and imagine relatively freely. So I'm just going to read a short section from when she arrived back for the first time after all these years in the Caribbean. Her real name, Jean Reese's real name, was Ella Gwendolyn Reese Williams. She was known as Gwen. Her husband was actually her literary agent as well, a man called Leslie Tilden Smith, and they had a very difficult relationship, which was not made any easier by the fact that she was dragging him across the Atlantic Ocean to the place that she nominally called home. And of course, what the novel really is about is that most problematic word in the English language, I think, which is home. The whole question of where do you belong? And as Robert Frost said, is it the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in? Is it really that simple? Is it a place where they recognize you? Is it a place where you feel at home? I think home has become a word which has become seriously problematized in the 20th century with increasing migration. And is going to become an increasingly problematic word in the 21st century. But it absolutely bedeviled this woman's life and caused her a great deal of misery. The final thing I want to say before I read this short passage is home has not just become a problem for the colonized, home is a problem for the colonizer as well. Because if you have an empire, you have to send people out to police that empire, and they're dislocated from home as well. So the whole of this strange enterprise called an empire engendered and gave rise to countless thousands of unmoored people, both the colonized and the colonizers. So in this short passage I'm going to read, which is appropriately called Home, I'm trying to look at the complexity of just who is unmoored and how this happens. Home. one other thing. She didn't go straight to Dominica. She stopped in St. Lucia en route and stayed in a guest house for a few days, almost as a sort of breathing space before she could make that re-entry to Dominica. From the deck of the SS Cuba, she gazed at the densely textured slopes of the St. Lucia hills. They were thickly matted with foliage, which exhausted every possible shade of green, and capped by an azure, cloudless sky, and she breathed out with relief, for she was home. They would remain here for a few days before taking a smaller vessel that would convey them north to Dominica, and her reconnection to a world that she hoped would lift the burden of anonymity from her tired shoulders. She looked at the lush island landscape and journeyed back in her mind to her childhood. She remembered her mother, busying herself in the living room, rearranging her father's books and newspapers, or meticulously draping the polished table in a lace cloth which always seemed to remain stubbornly decorated with a lattice of stiff folds. She also remembered her mother seated squarely in her bedroom before the looking glass and staring fixedly as though unable to see her own reflection. As the years passed by, she began to notice that her mother was becoming progressively more careless about polishing her nails and increasingly disinclined to trouble herself with the task of rouging her lips. She remembered her father, whose distrust of the English she now understood. But over the years she had trained herself to exercise caution once her father made an appearance, for his loss had plunged her into a state of despair from which she knew she had never truly recovered. As the SS Cuba edged its way into the crescent of the harbour, she fought hard to banish her father from her thoughts, but she had no desire to temper the elation of her arrival with the sorrowful affliction of grief. When she and her heavily perspiring husband finally arrived at their Castries guest house, they were met by an Englishwoman who appeared to be in charge, although she had some distant memory of the small property being owned by second or third cousins on her mother's side. Mrs. Ellis's face was heavily enamelled, which she presumed made it difficult for the strange-looking lady to express any emotion other than mild discomfort. But they dutifully followed the proprietress up a narrow wooden staircase, and they listened to the woman's sing-song voice as she apologetically recited the list of rules. Having run a finger along the top of the dresser to demonstrate the absence of dust, the woman untied a single key from a small assortment that she carried on a long ribbon around her neck, and she handed it to Leslie, closed the door, and then left the newly arrived couple in peace. She sat in silence for some moments on the side of the overly quilted twin bed before forcing herself to her feet. She glanced at her husband, who had slipped off his shoes and was spread-eagled across the coverlet, and then she decided to go out onto the balcony. Down below, on a small outcrop of rocks overlooking the wide expanse of the harbour, she saw a young negress standing by herself and pressing a headscarf to her hair, as though worried that a sudden flurry might at any moment strip it from her. Her husband soon joined her on the balcony, but neither of them said anything as they peered down on the woman, who stared blankly at the sea. And then, after a short interval, her husband retreated back into the room, leaving her alone. And she, in turn, took up a seat on a small metal chair. 2 hours later, the bright afternoon glare began to fade, and the day offered no resistance to the upsurge of night. After much tossing and turning in the lumpy bed, she woke suddenly to a blade of light streaming into the room. It was still dark, however, and she realized that the intrusive glow was from a street lamp that was situated just beneath their room. She had no inclination to disturb her husband, so she lay quietly and waited to be greeted by the noises of a West Indian day. To begin with, she heard the rattling of carts in the street, and the shrieking of seagulls wheeling in the ill-defined border between sea and land, and then the more boisterous and intrusive noises of the cook beginning to busy herself in the small yard to the side of the establishment. The woman would no doubt be preparing breakfast for the two guests from England, whom she had most likely been told would expect to be treated regally. The sluggish-looking Leslie opened his eyes, as though unsure of where exactly he was, and she took this as her cue to leave the bed, put on her dressing gown. Since their arrival, there had been no conversation of any substance between them, and it was difficult to determine if her husband was excited or disappointed. No doubt, once he discovered his bearings, he would have something to say. But in the meantime, she was grateful that he appeared to be allowing her time to re-enter her world in peace. She stepped out onto the balcony and looked down at the beach, where she saw a man riding a horse at a full gallop along the line where the sea was breaking in a flat, hushed whisper. With each hoofbeat, a small shower of brine exploded and animated the otherwise tranquil scene. She imagined the hunched rider being stirred by both the snorting and the wheezing of the animal and the roar of the wind in his ears, and she felt sure that the thunder of each stride would be rattling his every bone. But from her own distant vantage point, there was a mute, silken grace to the movement of man and horse. As it transpired, she spent the greater part of the day nursing her husband, who directly after breakfast succumbed to diarrhea, which forced him to remain confined to their room. It had been clear to her that the bacon was overcooked and she'd avoided it, fearing a failed attempt by the cook to compensate for the lack of any cold storage. But Leslie had eaten a hearty helping, whilst her husband tossed and turned, looking as though he might at any moment wilt in the heat and humidity. She was able to lightly doze in a wicker chair that was set in the shade away from the window, and accustom herself to the heavy thickness of the air. By late afternoon, Leslie had recovered sufficiently to be able to contemplate joining her for dinner, and she was relieved to see an untroubled ease to his gait as he made his way downstairs to the dining room. After dinner, they accepted Mrs. Ellis's offer to join her in the parlour and listen to Mr. Ellis playing the piano. As Mrs. Ellis introduced them to her mild-mannered husband, she instantly surmised that Mr. Ellis was the type of Englishman who, in the privacy of his own home, would habitually soak his feet in a basin of hot water and each night place his teeth in a glass. The man's dark eyebrows almost met, and his slightly slack-jawed mouth was disturbingly overcrowded with his ill-fitting denture. The proprietress informed her guests that when they lived in Kent, her husband used to provide the accompaniment to the silent pictures at the cinema, but tonight she and her husband would constitute his audience. Mr. Ellis proposed playing for them a selection of classical and popular favourites, although Mrs. Ellis quickly interrupted and warned them that her husband drew the line at German music, which had never had any place in his repertoire. Mrs. Ellis must have warmed to her guests, for before the onset of the recital, the woman offered them a specially imported blend of fragrant tea and a plate of sliced fruit cake, all served on what was clearly her best china. An hour later, Mr. Ellis concluded his presentation, but he remained seated at the piano, his dull, hooded eyes wide open, as he continued to stare at the keys where his meaty fingers remained poised. It was then that she noticed and Mr. Ellis was wearing brown carpet slippers with ill-matching socks, one grey and one black. And in an instant, she understood the Ellis's story to be one of difficulty and struggle. Mr. Ellis continued to wait, but for what? It was impossible for her to divine. Mrs. Ellis, on the other hand, seemed completely unperturbed by the melancholy stupor into which her husband appeared to have fallen. And she stood, and in one fluid movement she picked up the tray of tea and the untouched cake. With this done, she shuffled her way out of the room, and she closed the door behind her. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Ellis appeared to return to the world. Standing up from his piano stool, he padded his way to the drinks cabinet, inside of which was gathered a nest of small glasses and a bottle of sherry. He quietly poured 2 neat measures, which he handed to his guests, commenting that it helped with the cold on a dark night. And with this done, he poured himself an allowance, and then sat opposite them both, and it was possible for her to see that the man's eyes were now damp with emotion. As Mr. Ellis lifted the glass to his lips, she understood that he would say no more. And then, a few minutes later, Mrs. Ellis re-entered the room and looked tenderly at her tranquil husband and simply said, "It's time, Alfred." At which point, the man rose to his feet and diligently replaced his empty but unwashed glass in the cabinet. He then positioned himself by his wife's side, but he continued to look much affected, as though he'd suffered some great loss. "Good night," said Mrs. Ellis, offering them both the briefest glimpse of a smile. "Perhaps you'd be so kind as to turn out the lights when you retire." Once upstairs, she put on a cardigan and then opened the door to the balcony and took her glass of sherry with her out into the cool night air. The salty smell of the sea stung her nose with a sharpness she'd not noticed during the daytime, but she decided to remain outside until her husband had fallen asleep. It occurred to her that Mr. Ellis most likely felt obliged to obey his wife, for it was probably Mrs. Ellis's money, a bequest perhaps, that had enabled them to travel out to the West Indies. There was no doubt that it was her fierce energy that kept the hotel running smoothly, but Mr. Ellis appeared to be incapable of rising to meet such responsibilities. She conjectured that Mr. Ellis's dreams of a life in music, giving recitals and composing melodies, had been unhappily shipwrecked on the rocky shore of his wife's practical common sense. Over dinner, the woman had, after all, shared a little of her history with their guests. Alfred's doctor, she said, insisted that he wouldn't last another winter in England, so I said, for heaven's sake, let's find some sun. Out on the small balcony, a shiver ran through her as the wind rose, and she wondered if she'd correctly intuited the source of the sadness that hovered over the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Ellis. Thank you.
That was wonderful. It is now my great honor to introduce Amit Chaudhuri. I would like to begin with a quote from The Guardian's July 2008 In Praise Of editorial. "What a headache Amit Chaudhuri must be for his publishers," the editorial begins. "He puts out 4 novels to praise and awards, then breaks off to work on music." I like this quote because it evokes both our society's penchant for categorization and the skillful way in which Chaudhuri seems always to be navigating around these categories. He refuses to be bound within one genre, or even 2 or 3. He refuses to separate the mind from the body, thought from feeling, stories from critical theories, and music from poetry. Born in Calcutta, Amit Chaudhuri grew up in Bombay. He was a student at the Cathedral and John Connon School, took his first degree in English from University College London, and wrote his doctoral dissertation on D.H. Lawrence's poetry at Balliol College, Oxford. He is the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Friend of My Youth, and 4 nonfiction books. He is also a poet and musician trained and critically acclaimed in the North Indian classical tradition. In 2004, he began to conceptualize a project in experimental music, This Is Not Fusion, which received great critical acclaim and an overwhelming response from the audience upon its inaugural performance in Calcutta. This Is Not Fusion was released as an album in Britain on the award-winning independent jazz label Babel Label, and got excellent reviews from some of the most considerable music publications in the UK. His second CD, Found Music, came out in October 2010. His first major work of nonfiction, Calcutta, 2 Years in the City, was published in the UK, India, and the US in 2013. His first book of critical essays, the influential Clearing a Space, was published in 2008. His second book of essays, Telling Tales, came out in August 2013. Jonathan Coe, in the London Review of Books, has said that Chaudhuri has already proved that he can write better than just about anybody of his generation. The Guardian called him one of his generation's best writers. The Village Voice said he was one of the most talented and versatile writers of his generation. And according to the Boston Globe, quote, in the gloriously crowded world of modern Indian fiction, Amit Chaudhuri stands out as a master craftsman who with exquisite wit and grace can depict a rapidly changing India in a single life and an entire life in a single detail. Aline Battersby said in the Irish Times, even in the context of contemporary Indian writing in English, much of which is outstanding, Chaudhuri is the best. Among the prizes he has won for his fiction are the Commonwealth Literature Prize, the Betty Trask Award, the Encore Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Indian government's Sahitya Akademi Award. His first novel, A Strange and Sublime Address, is included in Colum Toibin and Carmen Khalil's 200 Best Novels of the Last 50 Years. His second novel, Afternoon Rag, was one of Anne Enright's list of 10 best short novels in The Guardian. He is a professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia and is editor of the Picador Vintage Book of Modern Indian Literature. He has a book of poetry, St. Cyril Road, and other poems. Chaudhuri is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a fellow of the English Association, and was a judge of the Man Booker International Prize. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed by this kind of litany of stuff. I'm very privileged to be here with Caryl Phillips, somebody I admired for decades, and over the day I've begun to admire as a person as well. I mean, actually over the letters he mentioned, the emails, somebody I feel close to. So it's as he said, it's a great bonus that this happened. I'm going to tell you quickly about what I'm going to read from. I'm audible, right? I mean, yeah.
It's a little hard to tell, but it is on.
It's on, yeah. So I'm reading from a friend of my youth, the last novel. Friend of My Youth has a character in it. The main character is, well, I don't know if he's the main character, but the person who's narrating the novel is somebody called Amit Chaudhuri. And I didn't set out to write a novel with Amit Chaudhuri in it, but I've always enjoyed writing into my novels the real names of the people I'm sometimes fleetingly portraying. I mean, my intention is never to fully flesh out every detail of their lives or give a trajectory of their lives, but let's say somebody is visiting somebody else, and that visit is of interest to me, and it might be based on an imagination of a visit, similar visit between two friends, where one might be my mother and the other, my mother's friend. And I might take pleasure in changing the mother character's name, but retaining the friend's name. I'm saying all of this to distinguish it from terms like autofiction and distinguish it also from postmodern self-reflexivity, which may or may not exist. It may be a critical invention. Maybe there is no such thing. But I'm nevertheless distinguishing my work from that, and saying that the point was never self-reflexivity. It was to see what would happen if this character were to retain this name. And it's interesting that Kaz mentioned both the idea of the home, but also read something out about a hotel. This book is about, it's a very short book, so I'm almost going to read out half of it. But it's about this writer visiting in early 2011 the city of Bombay where he grew up. As you mentioned of me. It's a city in which he no longer has a home. His parents, after retiring, left the city in 1989. And so when he's visiting Bombay for some reason, and the reason usually is that he's been invited to give a reading, something related to a book he's written, he regrets the fact that he doesn't get called to Bombay often enough. It seems that Bombay ignores him, but when he does, he clutches at the opportunity, and so here he is in Bombay. But he doesn't have a home in Bombay, the city in which he grew up, so he must always put up in a hotel room. And in this case, he's staying in a club organized by his publishers, as it happens in the same area, and looking out onto the building in which he grew up. He is in Bombay to read from his fifth novel, The Immortals, which is, as it happens, also my fifth novel. And the reading is actually never described. So the arrival, the evening, and part of the next day are described. These 1.5 days are kind of defined by a sense of dislocation. Firstly, from having to stay in this club, and stay in, the memory of having stayed in hotel rooms in this Bombay. Also, there's a sense of disorientation coming from the fact that the one friend from school that he's kept in touch with, a recovering drug addict called Ramu, has gone into a kind of punitive rehab after slipping very badly and almost dying. And this means Ramu has no access now to the outside world, and this has an unexpected impact on Amit's visit, something that he would not have foreseen if somebody had said to him that if Ramu were to disappear from Bombay, you would feel at a loss. But this is what happens, this is what he feels. One of the errands that he's been given by his wife to perform is to exchange some shoes of hers and his mother's at a shoe shop in a hotel called the Taj. So having nothing to do on that first afternoon, he goes off to the Taj with some shoes. As it happens, the Taj he confronts looks more or less as the Taj Mahal Hotel is supposed to look like. But he does know, and it's fresh in his mind, that the Taj Mahal Hotel was attacked by terrorists. I use scare quotes because I'm not very sure what that word means anymore, but attacked by terrorists, and part of it burnt and gutted. But it's been mostly put together again on this visit when he goes there to exchange these shoes. The second and third sections of the book are short sections where he arrives back in Bombay, and Ramu is back during these second and third sections. But I'm going to read out a little bit about the visit to the Taj and the shoe exchanging episode. But I'm going to time myself, and I will either skip or stop or read very fast if I see that I'm, taking too much time. Now, there's a man mentioned here called Hussein, who's no longer alive, but was a very famous artist in Bombay. Had to sort of get out of India because of a huge harassment from right-wing groups associated with the BJP. Hussein, as the name indicates, was a Muslim artist. Cloth bag in hand, I ascend the steps to the glass door. The handles to the doors unite in a horseshoe, the Joy Shoes logo. It's based on a breezy sketch executed by M.F. Hussein. Those were the days. Inside there's a picture Hussein painted specially for the shop, one of his incandescent horses. Why an animal that flies off the earth when it runs should be an appropriate symbol for footwear is beyond me. Will these shoes make us fleet-footed? Are they to be hammered into our souls? There's another story here. Hussein hardly wore footwear those days. He went around the streets of Bombay barefoot. In school, we relished an anecdote about Hussein being refused entry into Willingdon Club because he was shoeless. Hoity-toity rules serves him right. Someone saw him hopping later on the hot macadam. I enter and see the horse on my left. Hussein must be in his 90s now, 93 or 4. Of course, he doesn't live here anymore. He's unofficially exiled. Still, why not let the horse hang where it always did? A Hussein is a Hussein. Hello, sir, says, but his name's gone from my head. Exchange, no? He smiles and adds, when you came back? Just earlier today. He shakes his head mildly. Not so much a yes as acceptance. Mummy okay? She's all right, actually. In Bombay, you subtly shift your speech so you sound like the one speaking to you. You don't want to stand out. You want to sound more or less like you did when you were 12. Nothing's changed. She called, he says, half smiling. A woman in a pistachio sari, whose white foot cranes over a shoe, lifts her head. She looks candidly at me. It's a look that one well-to-do person passes prematurely to another. Really? Just now only, she was asking if you came. She gave instructions for her shoes and your wife's shoes. The woman in the sari looks vindicated. Perhaps the shoe fits. There are mirrors everywhere for us to examine our feet. I step out discreetly to get a better signal. Not far from me is the palatial back entrance, locked with finality. Which color do you want? I ask my wife. Tell them to bring out the Priya, she advises. She vacillates. See what the beige looks like. Also the black. No, actually I have a black one. Check the white. Why don't you decide for yourself? Actually don't. She blames my mother for her reliance on Joy shoes. They were unknown to her before she got married. Now she wears little else. By the time we met in Oxford, Bombay was history for me. Very recent history, but decidedly the past. I revealed my life in it to her piecemeal, guiltily, with a sly boastfulness, conveying without much effort how literally incredible it was and also how easily I let it go when I had the chance. I was back in. I walk back in. The colors of the classic designs are black, white, gold, and beige. But I've also spotted magenta on the heels. My mother is loyal to the Priya. She's incapable of wearing heels. She has a broken foot. My wife too abhors heels and the glitzier options. I pick up a glass slipper and wonder if I can tempt her. The classic designs don't evolve hugely. Instead, they become distilled. Extraneous bits, which you realize are extraneous after they are gone, are constantly sacrificed. The shoes grow sleeker and sparser. Munna has appeared, holding forth into the receiver behind the till, busy but reassuring. I recall he's a Muslim, but why can't I escape this thought? Distracted, he waves. The bonds of mutual loyalty are strong. Is he a Vura? There are many of them in Bombay. They are prosperous. Hello, 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 he says in a tone of congratulatory disbelief. How are you? Haven't seen you in a while, I concede, patting his shoulder. I came here about a year ago for a very short trip, he nods, when my new book came out, but I couldn't come to the shop. But your wife came to take some Priya, no? He asks, his memory razor sharp. Narrowing his eyes, he says, shit, she's not here this time. I shake my head. No, but she made it a point to send me. That's good, he says melodiously, smiles, scratches his beard. What's the name of the new book? I'm sure I read about it in the evening papers, or maybe in the Times. The Immortals. That's it, he exclaims, glancing at a stub, half submerged in the card machine. The roll's stuck. What's it about? This is a version of the how are you he's put to me already. I think of a succinct way of holding his attention. You know, I've described Joy Shoes in it. No, I got, but the steely bit of his attention still fixed on the stub. There's a young man in the novel, I continue, comes from an affluent family but pretends to be poor, wears torn kurtas, frayed jeans, but, I smile into his eyes, is always in Joy Shoes sandals. Ha, he cries, wondering what these behavioral traits add up to. What is it? It's a novel? Where can I find it? Good question, I think, and claim insouciantly. Just check in the bookshops. No one is sure anymore what the novel is. The word has unprecedented currency. People are thrown it intermittently, and sometimes they throw it back. For about a decade now, when I've hedged and said, in answer to some query about my profession, I write novels, people have occasionally countered with fiction or non-fiction. Someone said to me that the novel is now confused with the book. It's no longer understood as a form, but as writing itself. He shakes the roll loose. Must get a copy. My reason for telling Munna about Joy Shoes in The Immortals is not only to elicit a response or to make him feel like an honor is being bestowed on him. For me, given my writing is accused of coming directly from life, the aftermath of the book, in which people believe they've been written about and start to find their own correspondences, is the most interesting chapter. But glad to see all's well. Terrible stuff, what happened. I've been to Bombay once since November 2008, but feel like I haven't. I was watching it on TV in England, turned on the news, I couldn't believe my eyes. My God, says Munna, losing his smile. We had to go to a wedding that night, so we left early. Usually we begin shutting at 8. He gestures to his right without moving his eyes. Some of those fellows came in from there. He focuses. Mom's sandals are ready, no? I think he's gone in to check. We glance at the room, small as a monk's cell, in which shoes are secreted. Passing along the corridor, I turn right and come to the majestic red carpeted staircase. I climb up the stairs. Each step is capacious, as if people ascending were expected to make giant strides sideways. There's a lift, but no one in their right mind would enter the shell of the lift when the staircase is available. At the top of the right-hand stairs on the left is what for me is the old entrance to the sea lounge. But this, of course, is closed. Reaching the first floor, the entrance is on the right, diagonally. The sea lounge has had to be restored from scratch. It was reopened recently. Once I'm in, I find things have a rehearsed air. The notes on the piano of Yesterday Once More. The spacious sofas inhabited by large groups along the sides and in the center. I want a table by the window where only couples sit. There they are presenting their profiles painterly against the light. They're deep in themselves. There's a free table by the middle window. A tall waiter in white shirt and trousers and brown apron escorts me to the table and silently takes my order of Darjeeling tea and a plate of cookies. I don't like Darjeeling tea, but I'm buying time. It's not that far from dinner. Besides, I don't want to spend 500 rupees on bhel puri. I notice the waiters' uniforms haven't changed. But almost all the waiters are new. In the 70s, the Sea Lounge had a regularity in my consciousness as my parents used to come here late Saturday morning and occupy one of these tables by the window. Their order, like other things about them at the time, was unvarying. Chili cheese toast, tea. The Sea Lounge had a menu of arcane bites, chicken or mushroom vol au vent, the cream stored beneath volcanic flaps, Scandinavian open sandwiches. The idea of an open sandwich where the filling was left exposed, unprotected, was boldly counterintuitive. Then there was bhel and sev puri served on pristine china. My mother insisted we couldn't eat these off the pavement for fear of jaundice, but in the Sea Lounge, where they were made in conditions of uncompromising hygiene, her love of bhel was very evident. Sitting at the table, I glance out of the window on my right while the pianist tinkles away and I follow the notes, reconstituting the words. Those were such happy times, not so long ago. Every sha-la-la-la-la still shines. I get up. I know the toilets are far away and a tour awaits through long corridors. I temporarily abandon the table, leaving the Joy Shoes bag on a chair. Before stepping out, I eavesdrop on the pianist. A deeply serious man. Reticent, he glances at me, then returns to what looks, even sounds, like a bit of typing. The notes are clunky. I go through the doors, turn left. This stretch is like a balcony in a theater. Soon I'm at the inner corridor. When I turn left again, on my right is the crystal room. I might have been tempted to wander towards it and peep in, except I know that it's still under construction. Much at this end of the first floor was gutted. That great and useless space must have once, before I was born, been used for celebrations and felicitations, but I only remember its Christmas lunches, weddings, and sari exhibitions. I move away from it. It's a long walk down the corridor to the toilets. When you come to the end, you feel not so much that you're in another part of the hotel as in a different city. I chance upon an ornate and disheveled scene. Two handsome liveried men, employees of the hotel, stand watching a band of noisy people in bright clothes, bandhani saris, turbans. Maybe they are wedding guests, poor relations, or the family of musicians or artists who've come to perform at one of the restaurants. In which dialect are they shouting to each other? I go into the toilet, and a wave of perfectly maintained features, stonework framing basins, antique fittings on taps, engulfs me. I empty my bladder thoroughly. When I emerge, most of the party outside have disbanded. It was only for a moment they'd come together here. A liveried man is fading into the distance. Quiet has re-established itself with their departure. This is where the rooms are. Quiet, quiet. Beyond the access of interlopers. Those men made for this wing, of course, and the cat and mouse game lasted 4 days. People fleeing, hiding, dying, changing location at strange hours, led by staff. The CCTV footage captures flashes of it. The men with guns, intent, the guests and staff transiting at odd times of the night. All of them trapped, circling this wing. It's in the bad lighting of the CCTV video that the hotel echoes the mausoleum it's named after, in which tourists arc round the tombs encased in marble shrouded in the perpetual semi-dark of morning, where they can't take pictures. As a result, there's no record of our visits to Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan's resting places. The CCTV footage too, when you see it, seems almost an impossibility. How long will it take for the crystal room to be put together? They must be working on it at this very moment, although as I turn right, I hear no sound, no hammering, no drilling. I'm back in the sea lounge. They've done a good job. It's not so much a twin of the room that was destroyed or a replacement. What they have tried to do is follow the example of the moving image of the disintegrating object or edifice played backward, so that the shards and fragments, as you keep watching, fly up instantaneously and regain their old places until completion is achieved, and at last there's no discontinuity between past and present. Accustomed as we are to technology, we know it's an illusion. The shards are all there somewhere. It's just that the film has been reversed. Is this why Benjamin saw in Clay's Angelus Novus, which shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he's fixedly contemplating? The angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, he says. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It is caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. To be in the Taj is to experience its emergence from this storm. Like the angel, it's turned its back to the future it's once more moving towards. When I look around me in the sea lounge, I see its composure and reinstatement. The improvements are so unobtrusive you don't notice them, but I'm also confronting the debris. Shall I pour the tea, sir? But he will pour it. There's a rigor to his posture. He stays very straight while the tea trickles out. 3 lightly tanned cookies on the plate. I bite one. It turns to powder. This would have been a good moment to call Ramu. I look out of the window. He lives not far away. It's not like Ramu to consent to a regime that's made him incommunicado, but maybe there was no other remedy. Ordinarily, I might not feel the need to chat, but the fact that I have no choice except not to is making me restless. Anyway, our conversations are silly. They're designed to return us to our schoolboy persona. It's as if we haven't moved on from those days when we are with each other. I always hated school. Ramu both loved and hated it. All his best years were there, he claims. Yet he hated its glamorizing of sport. Not because, like me, he was bad at sport, but because he was so good at it. His housemasters wanted to exploit his abilities. He resisted, to their dismay. They never forgave him. Besides, the school was meant for rich children. Why did his father, he had asked me, an ordinary middle-class man with a small business, put him in a school meant for the Tatas, the Dubashes, the Jinwalas, the sons and daughters of CEOs, government ministers, and film actresses? Ramu's good at apportioning blame. I gesture to a man who's standing in my line of vision by the old exit. Bill, please. Yes, sir. Before he recedes, I say, the sea lounge looks good. He nods, indulgent. But the staff seems new, I confide. Yes, sir, he agrees, prolonging his puzzled nod. Mostly new only. Where's the old staff? Some left. He hesitates. Some died. Died? Yes, sir. He studies me, pauses, apologetic. I see. I fall silent. So that's why. But you've worked here for a long time. I've seen you before. 30 years, he explains. I was not here that day. When I'm leaving, he's standing by the macaroons. Sir, he says. I stop. I too feel I've seen you before. I nod but say nothing. The pianist's at it. He continues shyly, "Are you in the High Court?" I shake my head. Then add, "My father used to come here a lot, many years ago." He appears pained, groping, till something alters. His eyes widening, he asks, "Mr. Chaudhuri?" I'm disbelieving, as if I've glimpsed a ghost. These are the last vestiges of our life here. "Yes, he's my father." "Very good people," he says, unexpected with this belated certificate. "Sir and madam." Thank you.
We can, I think it's a small enough group, we can just take questions and answers. I guess you want to just be up here if you want, but it's a little awkward.
Could you talk more about the role the wheel plays in your work? Both of you. Amit, you specifically said you didn't want to be associated with autofiction, but you are drawing your certain aspects of the wheel into your novels. And of course, you're working on historical fiction, or at least using historical figures. So how does that figure in?
I love to read. Yeah. I think before I wrote my first novel, it was just as I was thinking of writing it, I wrote a little logo in my notebook. This would have been in 85, because I started writing in 86. And the logo said that however unexpected the imagined might be, it cannot be as unexpected as the real. And this was me as a young man, but I think I wrote it down because something in me felt it necessary to kind of state it to myself. I was insufficiently aware of the new kind of emphasis on fantasy, but also on fantasy as a kind of metaphorical device, Salman Rushdie Midwestern, and how important and ubiquitous that would become as an idea of thinking about narrative and fiction, especially from India. To me, it seemed important to posit, in spite of me not being clearly aware of this looming thing, to posit it against it almost in advance, only half aware of it. But when I say the real, I don't mean, again, the other thing I'm not comfortable with is a kind of psychological 19th century realism. When I say I love the real, that's not what I mean. I mean the things in between. I don't mean the real story, but what's on the edge of the story, or in between what's happening there. In that sense, autobiography, memoir, in as much as they are narratives about what happens to oneself, are of less interest to me, because I'm really not interested so much in narrative. I'm interested in the things that are happening between narratives, or between the narrative. That's what I'm engrossed by, absorbed by. Which is why I also depart from saying that this is autobiographical, or that I'm talking about my life or giving you my life. I'm not. I'm giving you things where nothing is happening. So I'm not giving you my life. I'm giving you something. I'm giving you life, but not my life. And that's the aim. I might fail at it, but that's what I'm interested in.
I think the first time I read biography of somebody I knew. I realized how complicated human beings' lives are, and the ability to hide from oneself. You know, it's happened a few times now where I've read biographies of people I've known them well, and those biographies make no sense to me, because the person I knew was not that person in that 400-page book. So I realized there's ample room to fictionalize somebody's life, because what those books never tell you is what kept that person awake night after night after night. What were the bad dreams that they were having? Why couldn't they get to sleep? Biographies never tell you that. That's left for you to speculate on. That's the area of fiction, that's the area of imagination. So I think that's what I was saying beforehand. There's always plenty of room to imagine in a person's life, even a person who you think their life is really well battened down and really very visible in the public domain. There's always plenty of room to imagine around it. I was thinking today about, I was listening to a lot of people on the radio and TV talking about Jacques Chirac, you know, the French president who died at 86 today, and a former president. And there's a lot of information about how long he was the mayor of Paris, how long he was the prime minister of France, how long he was the president of France, everything he did. He used to like to eat with farmers. He was born in Paris, but he's really a country boy. And I just kept thinking, you can go on for hours talking about him, but you're never going to get to the man. You're going to get aspects of the person, and there's always going to be an element that you, perhaps even he, which kind of maybe dovetails into what you're saying, Amit, that even he cannot possibly reimagine. You need somebody else to unpack it, if you like. So I never really think that I'm doing anything. It may be rooted in history, but it's about that unspoken, unconscious area. What Faulkner called, I thought, one of my favorite definitions of writing, when he said, you're really writing about the human heart in conflict with itself. And you're not going to find that in an obituary, and you're not going to find that in a biography. That's the human heart in conflict with itself is something you can only, you have to turn that over to a novelist or a poet to figure out the complexity of that. So I guess that's what I'm quarrying towards. The actual details that are in the public domain don't mean that much to me. I have to go beyond that somehow. I'll try to go beyond.
Yeah, I'm a writer, or I try to be, and I find myself sometimes getting so interested in the story and telling that I neglect the setting. It's sort of the first thing to go. It just, and I noticed with both your readings just how vivid the scene was invoked, and a really vague question, which is, how do you know, is it something that happens in the composition process or in the editing process when you've captured enough detail in the scene? When you've created and invoked enough to make it work on the page?
I'll buy some time.
Well, I mean, the editing process, I think, the putting down on the page and rereading sentence by sentence and moving on, always keeping in mind that the aim of what's being written is not to is not to supply information, is not to make plausible, is not to create a convincing picture. That's not the aim. The aim is to make possible what's only possible through that detail and sentence. So that kind of moment of opening up, of seeing, of listening, happens only there at that moment. So to see whether it's happened or not. So you're testing that, you're checking that for in a completely different way and for completely different reasons from looking to see whether it's looking convincing or plausible or not.
Yeah, I tend to agree. You know, I don't worry about setting too much to start with. As Amit said, it's in the editing. Because I think, I was thinking about this book, obviously, because I was just reading from it. When she arrived in England in 1906, 1907, she gets up early one morning and goes for a walk in the streets of London. She's staying in Bloomsbury in a hotel. And her aunt, who's a pain in the backside, is sharing a room with her. And so she just wants to get away from her pain of an aunt and get out into the streets of London. And she's walking down the street, she crosses the street, she goes, and I remember thinking, okay, hang on a second. Did they have horse-drawn stuff at that time, or did they have motorized stuff, or did they have like a mixture, or did they have trams, or did they have buses? And you see, that's where you start to think about the scene, and that's where you stop writing, because hello Wikipedia, all right? You're doing research, and somebody says, what are you doing? Well, yeah, I'm just researching my novel. That means you're not writing, and research is so much easier than writing, and so much more interesting, because you get all these pictures, and then you get little moving clips from MoMA about, you know, ooh, that's what was going on, flickering images, and you think, oh, look, there's something with a horse, so I'll have a horse that she has to dodge. Who cares, really? Because you can do all that afterwards. Once you've actually, what really counts is the emotional baggage that she's carrying at that moment on the street. That's what counts, not what she's having to avoid, not whether it's foggy. And you know, then you think, did they have fog? When did they clean up the streets? Or maybe they had that because in Prufrock, which is in the 20s, it was an unreal city and it was a bit of a Dickensian fog still. So then you go and read Prufrock again, just to check. You know. And you're not writing. So I agree. In the editing, you can fix all of that stuff, but you're looking for something else, I think.
And I wanted to have you, see if you'd be willing to expand on the comment you made about, I think it was postmodern fiction being sort of a critical invention, but an invention, an illusion. I didn't know if you meant that in the sense that literary critics have focused on a very small number of books which do that and taken that as much more exemplary of what fiction writers are doing in general, or if rather, even those books that are often described as postmodern, that's not a very good description, and it's just sort of a misleading way of thinking about what's going on. Or something else.
What I meant was this, it certainly occurs to me because, you know, I suppose postmodernism, in its experimentation with, let's say, quotation, it seemed to be different from, let's say, the modernist experimentation with quotation. And the difference seems to have to do with pointing to the fact that this is a text. This is a construct. In comparison to, let's say, modernist writing, where that is not the main kind of preoccupation of let's say, an assemblage of quotations. But here I'm talking about a kind of vulgarized idea of what postmodernism is or does, but it's a very, very prevalent idea. And why I said I don't know if such texts actually exist or whether they're inventions is because, I know a lot of texts. These aren't postmodern texts. I know a lot of texts through time and through history which are, in fact, extremely self-reflexive and are often devotional texts, often, other-centered rather than self-aware in the sense that postmodernism has it. Two examples always spring to mind. One is actually from, I mentioned devotional text, the Bengali version of the Ramayana, where some kind of discussion is going on between Ram and Sita, about Sita wanting to accompany Ram on exile. And this is there in an essay by the poet A.K. Ramanujan. This is mentioned, this particular section. Ram has been exiled. Sita wants to go with him on exile. Ram says, you can't come with me. You must stay at home. What are you going to do with me in the forest? And Sita, infuriated in the end, says, what on earth are you talking about? Haven't you read the Ramayana? It's clear that I go on exile with you. And this does not interfere with the magic, with the enchantment of that mythos. The thing about postmodernism, you think that it gives us something in place of magic. Magic becomes antedated, and what you have is some kind of self-reflexivity, a kind of knowledge about textuality. Here, the magic is there. The magic is not disturbed by this moment. The other person that I think of as an example is Pessoa, and the creation of heteronyms by Pessoa, and the creation of one particular heteronym. I think his name is Alberto Caryl, the naive poet, the nature poet. Astonishing poems, where he ends up saying, and I was the only nature poet. I was the one true nature poet. That's the last line of the sequence. Now you know, of course, that this is a fiction, that this is not, there is no Cairo, it is Pessoa. Yet it's not dramatic monologue, neither is it simply ironic play interfering with that statement, I was the only nature poet, because when you read I was the only nature poet, you believe it. He is the only nature poet. So in that sense, I think, I'm not sure if anything like that postmodernist reflexivity actually exists or not. If you...
Yeah.
Do you write in hotels?
Do you write in hotels?
Oh yeah, I always write in hotels. How did you know? I do, yeah. I've always written in hotels. I like the anonymity, I like the peace, I like the quiet, I like people bringing me food. I like to be able to drop towels on the floor and not have to clean up. I like the fact that the bill's coming, so I work hard because I've got to get out of there. I like the concentrated period of time where I don't have to worry about whether it's night or day. And if I need to sleep in the day and work at night, I can. So I've always I've always had a sort of period of time, usually towards the end of a novel, when things are reasonably, constructed and they just need polishing, shaping, editing. Push around the last lap. Hotels work for me. I tried it the other way once to get out of the starting blocks in a hotel, but I just seemed to get into the minibar. So I realized that wasn't really working. So the push to the end in a hotel is very good.
What about the sign saying that we're in the midst of an environmental crisis, so please reuse your targets?
Leave it hanging on the... no. What am I paying for? I was doing something more prosaic. I was referring to the question.
Do I write in hotels? Only if I have to.
I mean, the reason I asked, of course, is because you both read hotel pieces.
Yes.
And I was thinking, that there are various moments of considerations of displacement that you both seem to be addressing, where figures are sitting in hotels writing. I mean, I'm thinking of, Ralph Singh and the Mimic Men, for example. One can think of a number of different novels where that motif is also brought into play.
I'm filled with ennui on literary tours and deep existential self-questioning. It only happens to me on literary tours or at literary festivals. Why am I here? What am I doing here? All these questions come back with intensity at these moments. And in hotel rooms, I find myself sitting and pondering on these questions.
Well, I think literary book tours are their own special kind of hell. So you get to the hotel and you do things.
Yeah, a kind of examination of the conscience and various other things.
Yeah, but like how some people go to writing retreats, like McDowell or Yaddo or places where that are set up.
Those are here, actually.
Yeah, I don't like those. I don't like
those,
because you have to
those
talk to people.
There, I would use that metaphor.
Yeah. Well, talking to people isn't good for me when I'm trying to write. So I tried Yaddo once, and it was an abject failure because it was too social for me. And that's another reason why I like hotels is I go to places where I go to countries where I don't know anybody. So there's no possibility of ever being tempted to go for a beer with somebody or to. It's only once have I run into somebody when I've been, if you like, in retreat, trying to get around that last lap. You know this person, I think. It's absolutely typical. Because I used to go to Bangkok a lot, and I don't know anybody in Thailand. I don't know anybody in Bangkok. But I was checking into the hotel, the same hotel, obviously, all the time. 6 o'clock in the morning, I just got off a flight from Los Angeles, and I was standing at the desk. Pico Aya. Pico, one of his books is called The Global Soul. He travels everywhere. And Pico standing there. But that's the only time it's ever been disrupted, the isolation, the sense that there's going to be no temptation to do anything social or have any interaction.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could expand a bit on the idea of home that you were talking about, and you had talked about how in the 21st century we're experiencing a kind of migratory phase, whether it's from war and displacement, climate change, and so forth. I mean, it has various forms, even in the context of the city. The idea of gentrification, displacing the local population, is a much smaller version of that. But I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between home and identity in that context a bit more.
Well, I'm not sure I can improve on your question, actually, because I think you covered everything. And you covered everything eloquently, you know, down to gentrification, which is a type of displacement and a type of homelessness for so many people. We don't have to deal with the, you know, the larger global ramifications of migration, forced migrations, refugees, asylum seekers, you know, the impact of what climate's doing and climate change is doing in terms of movements of population, deforestation. I mean, you know, you said it all perfectly. These are issues which are becoming increasingly impinging on our daily lives, the lives of our friends and families, if not ourselves directly, definitely indirectly. I don't think there's many people in the world today who are not conscious of the complexity that's rooted in the word home, you know, the tentative purchase that we all have on this notion of belonging, how it can be torn away from us very, very quickly. I mean, it's you know, Amit's reading is shot through with questions of belonging, questions of home, questions of stability, continuity. But I think that's our, I mean, I hesitate to use a phrase as pompous as our global condition, but there you go, I just used it. But I feel, you know, I mean, the one thing, the PS I will say to this is, I grew up in Britain, which masquerades as a country that doesn't have a migrant history. So I was made to feel that I was a freak, because I was visibly a migrant, and that I was in a minority, you know, a rather uncomfortable minority as somebody who couldn't trace back their grandparents, their great-grandparents' roots to this village, or to this county, or to this town. And that the mobility which had been a part of my history as a colonial migrant was a reductive history. I think that there's been something of certainly a change in my thinking, if possibly not a change in British thinking, but that's a whole other seminar. But there's certainly been a change in my thinking where I feel I'm surrounded, whether I'm in a teacher in a classroom, or whether I'm sitting on a bus, whether I'm sitting on a plane, whether I'm in a coffee bar. I'm surrounded by people who I can look at them and I can see, without having to say anything, that questions of home and belonging are bedeviling their lives in some way. Doesn't make me feel happy, because they then have to resolve these problems and these conundrums and these issues. But I hope that, you know, by writing, by teaching, talking to people, you're doing something to perhaps answer some of the questions that they might have.
I was going to read out a short paragraph from a friend of my youth to reply to your question, but I won't do that. I'll try and, because it's about the word home, that particular paragraph. But you can go and have it.
Buy it.
Yeah, you can buy it. That's what I, midway through the thought, I thought, let me finish it. But anyway, I don't know, I mean, the word is, I don't know what it means. It has so much kind of baggage that my mind is blank, but I do know that my life has been governed, my decisions have been governed by that word in all kinds of ways. Let me give you an example. You know that I've spent many years in England as a student, and then as somebody who's worked there, who's lived there. I always sort of sabotaged my sort of chances of becoming a permanent resident in the UK. And I did this sort of knowingly, deferring this moment when I would become a permanent resident. Until now, at the age of 57, I mean, I don't know how, I'm still deferring it. I began my journey there at the age of 21. You don't become a permanent resident unless you've lived there for more than 6 months for 5 consecutive years, or whatever the case. For a student, 10 years it used to be, for 5 or 4 consecutive years. And I've had multiple kind of visas. And so basically what it means is, leave aside the whole idea of citizenship, which to me is something that I can't even think about or consider. It basically means that I work in England and I have to keep applying for visas every few years. Or I was telling Kaz about having to change a visa I was working on in order to take up a fellowship in Paris. To change it completely, otherwise I'm going to lose my job. You know? So be in that position, while having had the satisfaction of having sabotaged the kind of chances of my not being in that position, which was very easily achievable for me. So that was a kind of activism that I unconsciously undertook. I am not a nationalist. I don't know what it is that India gives me, but it gives me something. So I think that's one of the reasons why I spent more than 6 months every year. I think what it gives me when I think about it is an intimacy with various things. I can imagine being an American and being intimate with American literature, admiring Indian literature. But as an Indian, I can be as intimate with American literature as I am with Indian. It's a country with this possibility of multiple forms of intimacy with cultures. And not just ancient cultures, modern cultures as well. So I say this not with pride, but I'm trying to understand what it is I get, why I want to hang on to that vantage point. Because it's more the vantage point that I want to hang on to than any sense of citizenship or home or whatever. So, sorry, maybe I couldn't answer the question about home that much, but the situation I am in is a very real one.
Well, why don't we, any final questions? Why don't we then, another round of applause for our two guys. You can indeed purchase